It is unfortunately a sad reality that thousands upon thousands of false converts have been sown amongst the true wheat of the church. There is no denying there are large, unprecedented numbers of people within evangelical Christianity who are professing to have become Christians, but who in fact have not truly come to Christ at all. And that is heartbreaking. And of course, what is even more heartbreaking is the fact that the vast majority of those false converts are themselves blind to the reality that they are still yet unsaved. And here's the most disconcerting part of all of this. The error, in this case, is coming tragically not from cults, not from totally apostate churches, but from mainstream evangelical pastors and preachers and Christians. Pastors, preachers, and Christians who are selectively citing Scripture to present, of all things, an increasingly diluted, more broadly accepted gospel. And despite the fact that this is happening, very often unintentionally, make no mistake about it, it is happening in unprecedented fashion. As Bob DeWay wrote in his Critical Issues Commentary newsletter,
an alarming convergence of theological and cultural trends in contemporary evangelicalism is pushing gospel preaching out of many churches. Even in Bible-believing churches, people are being asked to make a decision for Jesus without being told who Jesus is, what he has done, or why they need him. But in the Bible, it is God's glory and conversions through faith and by God's grace that are supposed to be the goals, not merely decisions. And in many cases, those who are failing to preach a biblical gospel vehemently deny that they are so failing. But by searching the New Testament to see what the true gospel is, how it was preached by Christ and his apostles, and comparing and contrasting that to the modern approach, we can quickly see for ourselves how more and more of contemporary evangelicalism does in fact fail to preach the gospel. I will also suggest a simple remedy to the problem: gospel preaching.
Bob DeWay is absolutely correct. We need to get back to preaching the gospel in our churches today. And I mean the whole gospel. And that is precisely why in this program, a program about the dangerous error of presenting half-truths in the church today, and as part of our overall series dedicated to training Christians everywhere how to rightly divide the word of truth, we're going to examine the modern presentation of the gospel. And we're going to compare and contrast it with scriptural evangelism. And when we do so, Lord willing, it will become even clearer how and why, once again, good hermeneutics can protect Christians from dangerous misinterpretations and misapplications of Scripture. In their zeal to create converts, many, even very sincere pastors and preachers are selectively quoting only certain scriptural passages at their crusades, in their sermons, and during their altar calls. Certain scriptural passages that overemphasize only one side of the gospel. So things like the freeness of the gospel, for example, and or the grace and love of God, and or the atoning work of Christ for all who believe, and or really a limited number of other important facets of the gospel, are all preached in great detail and in passionate sermons, which of course, as topics considered in and of themselves, are not only very true and very biblical, but very appropriate doctrines to emphasize. But in their zeal to communicate the wonderful good news of the gospel and to proclaim the amazing grace of God, many of these pastors and preachers find themselves, either intentionally or unintentionally, committing the very same error of selective citing that most aberrant cults commit. And if you recall in our last program, we examined very carefully the Jehovah's Witnesses' deceptive use of that very dangerous interpretational error called selective citing. And the specific example that we gave was the tendency for the Jehovah's Witness evangelist to present only half the picture of Jesus' nature by selectively citing verses that speak of Jesus' humanity, and yet scrupulously avoiding the many verses and passages that speak of Christ's divinity. And that is the very essence of the error of selective citing. Select what you want and ignore the rest. And also in our last program, we discussed the fact that although it is disturbing to see a cult malign the truth of Scripture, using Scripture, it is even more disconcerting to see professing evangelical Christians do so, and especially when it's the shepherds in the pulpits who are promoting much of the error, when they're supposed to be the ones protecting the sheep from error. But nonetheless, that's the very thing that's happening more and more today. The gospel is increasingly being presented in such a manner that the freeness of the gospel and the love of God and other more positive passages that people respond well to are being selectively cited and passionately presented in great and thorough detail. But then, other very relevant passages, passages that fill in a far more complete and far more accurate picture of genuine salvation, but that tend to be more confrontational and unpleasant to the flesh, are minimized, underemphasized, and sometimes even completely left out. And this matter of preaching half a gospel is no small uncommon occurrence.